Hey guys, tonight we're going to venture into a culinary world that'll have you questioning just what kind of breakfast you've been enjoying all these years. Imagine waking up in a Victorian home in the late 1800s. You might be greeted with an extravagant breakfast, but it's nothing like the simplicity of toast and eggs you're used to. Instead, there's a pot of stewed tongue, a pile of grilled kidneys, and a glass of something, potentially made with meat stock. Welcome to the strange breakfasts of the Victorian era. Trust me, you probably won't survive this without a few raised eyebrows. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want, drop a comment with your location and the time where you're tuning in. Always love seeing how far we're travelling with these stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorians had a rather odd relationship with breakfast. Unlike today, when many of us scrambled to get a quick bite before heading out the door, breakfast in Victorian times was seen as an important event, almost a ritual. The morning meal could range from the hearty to the downright strange. It was a time when meat was considered an essential part of the day. Grilled kidneys, fried bacon, and stewed tongue were staples, but not in the sense you're familiar with. Now, this was a breakfast where you might find an entire boiled head of a calf, or perhaps a dish of cold pie, because why not start your day with a little pastry? But that's not all. If you were truly in the upper class, your breakfast might include exotic foods that would make today's brunch seem like child's play. Crocodile meat, imported from the wilds of Africa, might have appeared on the table next to a hefty portion of marinated eel. The Victorians had access to strange meats from all corners of the British Empire: ostrich, venison, and even bison, all part of the quest for new, exciting flavours and a chance to flaunt one's wealth. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were genuinely curious about these new foods, or if they simply wanted to one-up each other at the breakfast table. Victorian breakfasts also featured complex combinations of sweet and savoury. Picture this: a slice of meat pie alongside a bowl of jam or honey, washed down with a hot cup of strong tea. It's clear that they didn't subscribe to our modern notion of balancing flavours. To them, a meal was an opportunity to try anything and everything. If the food was exotic, spicy, or expensive, well, it was perfect for breakfast. So let's see what kind of oddities the Victorians believed belonged on the first meal of the day. So, you've survived a Victorian breakfast, and you might be wondering, how could it get any weirder? Well, buckle up, because now we're diving into the strange, exotic world of meats that the Victorians were chomping down on. Crocodile, ostrich, and more. These meats weren't exactly common fare for your average Brit, but in the Victorian era, they became all the rage among those seeking to flaunt their wealth and sophistication. Now, imagine it's the mid-1800s. You're in London, and the aristocracy is looking for new ways to demonstrate their global influence and adventurous taste. What better way to show off than by adding some exotic meats to the menu? Enter the crocodile. Yes, crocodile. The Victorians were keen to sample meat from far-off places, and this terrifying reptile was a symbol of the exotic, the rare, the you probably wouldn't survive this level of culinary daredevilry. Crocodile meat was sometimes stewed or served as a roast, with its tough texture making it more of a challenge than a delight. Historians still argue whether the appeal of crocodile meat was driven more by novelty or an actual desire for the flavours. But one thing is for sure, it was a dish meant to impress guests, not to fill the stomach. And the crocodile wasn't alone in this bizarre culinary world. Ostrich meat, often described as a delicate fowl, was another favourite. Ostriches were large, exotic, and, in the eyes of the Victorians, a perfect stand-in for the more conventional and possibly boring beef or chicken. Sometimes it was served in a rich gravy or as a roasted whole bird, with the meat compared to beef, but with a hint of game. But of course, the ostrich didn't come without its own quirks. Its massive size meant that cooking one took time and effort, and despite all the hype, the taste often didn't match the grandeur of the bird itself. Historians have debated whether the Victorians genuinely found ostrich meat delicious, or if it was more about showing off the luxury of eating something that no one else had. It wasn't just the large, intimidating creatures that were on the menu, though. The Victorians were also into trying smaller, less fearsome animals, Some might say even ones that were completely unnecessary to eat. Ever heard of guinea pig? Yes, in Victorian times, guinea pigs were raised and eaten as a delicacy, especially in parts of South America, and they made their way to the dinner tables of the wealthy. They were considered quite the delicacy in London, often roasted and served with a bit of mint sauce, though it's safe to say this isn't the kind of thing you'd want to see on your plate today. But alas, this oddity was another example of the Victorians' obsession with food from distant lands. The fascination with exotic meats was fueled not just by the desire to try new things, but by the Victorians' obsession with discovery. As the British Empire expanded across the globe, so did its influence on the table. In a way, these rare meats served most a single desireming and taking themselves into Victorians' aside. The fascination with exotic meats was fueled not just by the desire to try new things, but by the Victorians' obsession with discovery. As the British Empire expanded across the globe, so did its influence on the table. In a way, these rare meats served as a symbol of imperial power. The rarer the animal, the more prestigious the dinner. And it wasn't just about the taste. These meals were about status. Dining on such meats was a statement, a reminder to all that the British elite had the means to acquire the world's most exotic foods. But not everyone was on board with the idea of eating crocodiles and ostriches. There were always voices of skepticism and disgust, particularly from those who believed that there was no need to devour animals just for the sake of novelty. It's a bit like the modern-day fascination with expensive and outlandish foods, isn't it? Only back then, the meals were more likely to include a whole roasted ostrich than a $1,000 plate of gold leaf sushi. Historians are still torn on the idea of exotic meats as a food trend. Some argue that it was an extension of the Victorian fascination with everything foreign, while others suggest it was a sign of excess. Either way, these meats left a lasting impression on the British palate, and their popularity persisted long enough to influence later food trends. Now that we've explored the extravagant meats that could appear on a Victorian dinner table, let's take a step into the bizarre world of one particularly infamous dish, mock turtle soup. This dish is practically a Victorian icon, a strange concoction that not only pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, but also served as a reminder of how far the Victorians were willing to go to recreate something they could never really have. So, what makes mock turtle soup so peculiar? Well, to start, it wasn't made from turtles at all. The Victorians were big fans of mock versions of foods, substitutes that were often cheaper or more readily available. The mock turtle soup, for example, was a substitute for the real turtle soup, which was made from, you guessed it, actual turtle meat, often green turtle, a luxury ingredient in the early 19th century. But turtles were expensive, and their availability dwindled, so enter the Victorian solution. Substitute it with something far less exotic, but surprisingly similar in texture and flavour, calf's head. Yes, calf's head. A cheaper and more readily available cut of meat was stewed and shredded to mimic the texture of turtle meat. Historians still argue whether the Victorians created mock turtle soup as a way to keep the prestige of turtle soup alive while making it more affordable, or if it was simply a weird culinary experiment. Either way, it became quite the popular dish, and it wasn't long before mock turtle soup appeared in nearly every Victorian cookbook. To give it the proper turtle soup vibe, it was seasoned with the same ingredients you'd expect in a rich broth: hard-boiled eggs, lemon, and even a little sherry for that special touch. Often it was thickened with a mix of vegetables, breadcrumbs, and veal stock, making for a dish that was rich, complex, and surprisingly flavourful, considering it was, in essence, a cheat. But the true beauty of mock turtle soup lay not in its taste, but in the delightfully absurd lengths the Victorians would go to make it as close to the real thing as possible. Some chefs even went as far as to add turtle-shaped garnishes to the soup for the sake of authenticity. Because, apparently, what a dish lacks in ingredients, it can make up for in shape. Mock turtle soup wasn't just for the elite, though. As the soup became more popular, it made its way to mid-tier dining establishments and even trickled down to the middle class. The soup's fame spread like wildfire, largely thanks to its role in Victorian dinner parties, where having a high society dish like mock turtle soup was the ultimate social currency. But let's not overlook the more macabre side of things. Mock turtle soup is more than just a quirky meal, it's a representation of Victorian attitudes toward food and class. The Victorians loved food that symbolised luxury and refinement, even if it didn't quite have the pedigree to match. You see, the ability to serve a mock version of something prestigious was itself a form of status. It suggested a cleverness, an ability to recreate luxury without having to spend the enormous amounts of money it would take to import real turtle meat. And isn't that the very essence of Victorian society? Trying to have it all, but often with a bit of a twist. Historians still debate whether mock turtle soup could be considered a culinary cheat or a creative culinary solution. The debate may never end. But what's clear is that the soup became such a fixture of the era that no Victorian dinner party was truly complete without it. And it wasn't just the main ingredients that made mock turtle soup special. It was the accompanying garnishes that really set it apart. Pickled vegetables, olives, and even crispy croutons were sprinkled atop the dish to give it texture and extra flair. Some versions of mock turtle soup would even include a bit of quail's egg or sliced veal, adding extra richness and decadence to the already complex dish. It's no wonder that mock turtle soup was often considered a symbol of high society. It wasn't just a meal, it was a status symbol wrapped in a bowl of broth. As we continue our journey through the strange culinary landscape of the Victorian era, it's time to dive into the peculiar and at times unsettling world of jellied meats. While today jelly is usually reserved for sweets and desserts, in the Victorian era it was a common feature on dinner tables and not in the form of fruit or sugary confections. No, the Victorians took their jelly very seriously, and it often came in the form of jellied meats that had been cooked, set in gelatin, and then served cold. Intrigued? You should be. This gelatinous form of cuisine was just another quirk of the Victorian obsession with texture, flavour, and presentation. To understand jellied meats, we first need to talk about aspic, a dish made from meat stock, clarified, and then set into a jelly-like consistency. Aspic was used to preserve meats for longer periods, and was often served as a decorative garnish for meat dishes or even as the main event at a lavish dinner. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were genuinely fond of the slimy texture of jellied meats, or if it was simply a trend driven by the growing fascination with preserving food. Either way, the dish became a staple at upper-class banquets and a favoured way of presenting meats at elegant dinners. One of the most famous examples of jellied meats was jellied eels. Yes, you read that correctly. Eels, which were often found swimming in the muddy waters of London's Thames River, became a prized dish when served in jelly. The process was simple. The eels were boiled, then placed in a mould, and covered with a gelatin made from boiling down the fish bones and skin. Once set, the dish was often served cold, garnished with vinegar, and sometimes with a bit of parsley or pepper for extra flair. But let's be real. The appeal of jellied eels probably wasn't in the flavour, but rather in its unique presentation and the novelty of eating something so strange. For the Victorians, eating jellied eels was more about the social cachet of indulging in something that was simultaneously luxurious and utterly bizarre. If you're wondering how jellied meats could become so widespread, it's because they were not just served as a novelty, they were often considered a practical meal. Aspic made it easier to preserve meats, especially when refrigeration wasn't available. By setting the meats in a jelly, the Victorians could keep them fresh for longer and use the gelatin to bind the meats together, creating a kind of edible sculpture. It wasn't uncommon to see entire jellied chicken or jellied ham as centerpieces on Victorian tables, with intricate patterns formed by the delicate layers of meat and jelly. These dishes were not just food, they were works of art. But of course the jellied meat trend didn't stop with eels and chicken. The Victorians became quite inventive in their use of aspic. Some recipes even called for jellied pigeon, a dish that could be seen on the menus of fancy restaurants. It wasn't just the flavour that mattered, it was the presentation. The jelly encasing the meat served as a glossy, translucent armour, highlighting the bright colours of the meat beneath. For the Victorians, food was as much about appearance as it was about taste. and jellied meats certainly fit the bill. Of course, not all Victorians were enamoured with jellied meats. There were plenty of critics who found the concept of eating a gelatinous meat mould rather off-putting. But even among the critics, jellied meats had a certain mystique, a bit of an only the bold need apply reputation. And so, despite its oddities, jellied meats became ingrained in Victorian culture. Historians often debate whether the popularity of jellied meats was driven more by practicality, being able to preserve and present food in an innovative way, or by the Victorians' love for the novelty of the strange. Some even argue that the rise of jellied meats reflects a larger trend of Victorian excess, a time when the wealthy sought to outdo one another with bizarre and extravagant food displays that not only tested the limits of taste, but of what could be consumed in the name of fashion. While jellied meats might seem strange to us today, it's important to remember that in the context of the Victorian era, food was a symbol of status, sophistication, and invention. The desire to eat something as unusual as jellied eels wasn't about the taste. It was about being part of the cultural conversation. And if you could make a dish that was both strange and somehow refined, well, that was a sign of true culinary prowess. So, let's raise a glass to the Victorian love of weird food, because who else could turn a simple gelatin dessert into a symbol of high society? As we continue our exploration of the curious cuisine of the Victorian era, we find ourselves diving into an area that was less about the unusual ingredients and more about the ahove use of spices. You might think that a simple, flavourful stew would be a comfort food of the time, but no. The Victorians liked to go big, or rather, they liked to go a bit too far. If you were lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to dine at a Victorian banquet, you'd often find yourself faced with dishes that could only be described as a spicy confusion of flavours. Sweet, savoury, hot and cold, often all at once. Let's start with spiced pies, a classic example of Victorian overindulgence. Picture a large golden pastry filled not with the comforting flavours of apples or berries, but with a strange, almost overwhelming mix of meats, fruits and spices. They didn't just add a pinch of cinnamon to a meat pie, they loaded the filling with cloves, cinnamon, allspice and nutmeg, all while mixing in rich cuts of meat like beef, lamb and veal. Historians still argue whether this excessive use of spices was a true representation of Victorian luxury or simply a misguided attempt at sophistication. Were the spices meant to enhance the flavour, or were they a signal to others that no expense had been spared in preparing the dish? But the spice overload didn't stop there. The Victorians took the same approach to their sauces, which were often so complex that they became the focal point of the entire meal. Think of sauces that combined mustard, sugar, vinegar and wine, each competing for dominance in the dish. The infamous brown sauce, a tangy, thick concoction, could smother anything from sausages to puddings, and the key to making it was getting that balance just right. Not too sour, not too sweet, and definitely not too much mustard, lest you find yourself choking on the spice. As you might imagine, the resulting sauces were both overwhelming and delightful, depending on who was in charge of the cooking. But it wasn't just about savoury dishes. Victorians also had a knack for mixing spices into their desserts in ways that would make today's bakers scratch their heads. Imagine a spiced fruit salad made with apples, raisins, and a generous helping of cinnamon, cloves, and even black pepper. Yes, black pepper in fruit salad. It sounds bizarre, but for the Victorians, it was a sign of culinary sophistication. Historians often speculate that the reason the Victorians went so far with spices was due to their fascination with exoticism. As the British Empire expanded, spices from all over the world became more accessible, and with that accessibility came an overwhelming urge to incorporate them into every dish, even if it meant turning a simple dessert into a taste explosion that no one could quite understand. There were other curious concoctions, like spicy fruit pies. The Victorians didn't just bake apples or cherries into their crusts. They piled in fruits like pineapple, figs and quinces, then layered them with a medley of spices like cardamom and ginger. The end result? A pie that seemed to be both sweet and savoury, with a complexity that made it almost too much for the untrained palate. Historians argue that the Victorians were so eager to showcase their newly discovered wealth of spices that they couldn't resist pushing them to their limits. But were these spice-heavy pies actually delicious? Or were they just another food trend gone overboard? And let's not forget about the pickled vegetables, another favourite that relied heavily on vinegar, spices and sugar to create the perfect balance. The Victorians had a strange obsession with pickles, serving them as condiments alongside almost every dish. Whether it was a dollop of mustard pickle with your roast beef, or a few spicy gherkins alongside your pie, it seemed like no meal was complete without something pickled. The pickled onions and pickled cabbage were particularly popular, with some even served in spiced vinegar, which would make the dish as tangy and spicy as possible. Historians still debate whether these pungent condiments were seen as a palate cleanser or simply a necessary accompaniment to the overly rich main courses. The strange part about these spicy dishes is that, while they were clearly an effort to impress, they weren't always the most well received. Many people found the overwhelming spice mixes difficult to stomach, especially when they were paired with overly rich meats and heavy sauces. But the Victorians were nothing if not persistent, and these dishes continued to grace the tables of the upper classes and become a part of the nation's food heritage. Historians argue whether these intense spice mixes were truly born out of a love for flavour, or if they were more a reflection of the Victorian desire to show off. Was it a genuine quest for new tastes, or simply a matter of excess? The answer is likely a bit of both. The Victorians loved to experiment with new ingredients, and spices were just one more tool in their culinary arsenal. However, the results often left much to be desired, with some dishes resulting in a strange mishmash of flavours that left many wondering if perhaps less was more. As we move further into the peculiarities of Victorian dining, it's time to uncover a food trend that was as bewildering as it was unexpected: the mystery of fruit soup. Yes, you read that correctly. Fruit soup, often served as a dessert or, oddly enough, even as part of the main course. It sounds strange, doesn't it? A dish that's neither sweet enough to be a dessert nor savoury enough to be a meal. But in the Victorian era, fruit soup was a genuine culinary phenomenon, served in households from the upper echelons of society to more modest settings. And yet, despite its popularity, no one can quite agree on whether it was a success or just a culinary misstep. To start, we need to dive into the way fruit soup was prepared. Unlike the fresh, juicy fruit salads we enjoy today, Victorian fruit soups were often served cold, a practice that made the dish feel even more disorienting. They were typically made by boiling fruits, such as apples, peaches, or berries, along with a variety of spices and sugar, to create a sweet, tangy broth that could be eaten as either a side or a dessert. But the real kicker: sometimes this strange fruit concoction would be thickened with flour, giving it the texture of a savoury soup rather than a dessert. Historians still argue whether this was simply an unfortunate attempt at culinary fusion, or if the Victorians had genuinely stumbled upon a misunderstood masterpiece. The rich sweetness of the fruit would blend with the thickened broth, resulting in something akin to a very odd porridge that no one could quite place. Was it soup? Was it dessert? Or was it some kind of middle ground designed to baffle guests, while still giving the impression of sophistication? Whatever the answer, it certainly earned its place in Victorian kitchens. Some versions of fruit soup had an extra twist. They were spiced, as if fruit itself wasn't controversial enough. The addition of cinnamon, cloves, or even bay leaves turned these fruit broths into something almost unrecognisable. Imagine slurping down a spoonful of apple soup, only to be hit with a wave of clove, an odd combination that left many Victorian diners scratching their heads. These spicy fruit soups were often served cold at banquets, where they were a shocking contrast to the hot meats and stews surrounding them. But the real oddity of the fruit soup wasn't the ingredients themselves. It was the purpose behind serving such a bizarre dish. Historians believe that fruit soups were a way for Victorians to elevate the humble fruit, turning it into something elegant and refined, almost like a secret trick to impress guests. If your fruit soup had the right balance of sugar, spice and texture, it was a surefire way to show off your cooking skills. In a society where food was so often about status, the unusual nature of fruit soup served as a conversation starter, a curious dish that had people wondering if you were truly avant-garde in your culinary choices, or just very confused about how fruit should be served. And then there were the more experimental versions, those that went beyond fruit alone and added even more unusual ingredients to the mix. Some recipes included breadcrumbs or even custard, giving the soup a creamy, heavier texture that felt more like a custard pudding than a fresh fruit dessert. The Victorian obsession with presentation and culinary novelty was on full display here. Fruit soup wasn't just about eating, it was about showing that you could take something as common as fruit and turn it into a dish worthy of elite society. Historians still debate whether fruit soups were an elegant innovation or a culinary faux pas. Some argue that they were simply another example of the Victorian desire for excess, a desire to take simple, everyday ingredients and turn them into something flashy and sophisticated. Others suggest that fruit soups were a reflection of the era's fascination with experimentation, as the Victorians eagerly embraced new ideas from the vast and varied regions of their empire. Whatever the reason, fruit soups became a fixture in Victorian culinary culture, and even though they seem out of place to modern palates, they served their purpose, adding an air of mystery, complexity, and status to any meal. For all their oddities, they weren't just strange concoctions. They were symbols of a time when food was about far more than sustenance. It was about impressing your guests, showing your social standing, and, above all, indulging in a bit of extravagance, even if that meant spooning your way through a cold, spiced fruit broth. As we step away from the strange world of fruit soups, it's time to explore one of the Victorian era's most curious food trends, the marrowbones and cow's tongue craze. You might be wondering how something as simple and, frankly, unappetizing as cow's tongue became a coveted delicacy. But in Victorian times, the cow's tongue was seen as a prized cut. This was not a society that shied away from what we would today consider unusual or unappealing cuts of meat. No, the Victorians found beauty in the more unusual parts of the animal, and they weren't afraid to serve it at the grandest of dinner parties. The cow's tongue was often boiled, then braised or pickled, and served in a variety of ways. The idea was to slow cook the meat until it was so tender that it could be sliced thin and served cold, sometimes with a tangy mustard sauce. But it didn't stop there. In some homes, the tongue would be roasted whole, allowing its rich, fatty layers to crisp up, while the inside remained moist and tender. It was typically served as an appetizer or a side dish, and it became a staple at both informal meals and extravagant banquets. Historians still debate why cow's tongue became so fashionable. Was it a matter of taste, or was it simply another way for the Victorians to show off their wealth and ability to procure even the most unusual cuts of meat? The mystery of its popularity persists. But the cow's tongue wasn't the only unusual part of the cow that made its way onto the Victorian dinner table. Marrowbones, another oddity, were highly sought after. The marrow inside the bones was scooped out, often served with a sprinkle of salt and pepper, or melted into a rich broth. For the Victorians, marrow was considered a luxury. Its richness and ability to add depth to soups and stews made it a prized ingredient. Marrowbones weren't just about eating, they were a symbol of indulgence, a way to demonstrate that you had access to the best, most refined ingredients available. Whether served as part of a hearty soup or roasted with vegetables, marrowbones were a regular fixture on the tables of the Victorian upper class. Historians argue whether the fascination with marrowbones and cow's tongue was driven more by a desire for culinary refinement or by practicality. On the one hand, these cuts were relatively inexpensive compared to other prime meats, making them more accessible to the middle and lower classes. On the other hand, there was something inherently luxurious about serving a dish that was considered more exotic by the standards of the time. Think about it. How many people today would consider a cow's tongue or marrowbones a treat? For the Victorians, these dishes were an opportunity to demonstrate their ability to enjoy food that was less ordinary and more in tune with the latest culinary trends. After exploring the curious world of marrowbones and cow's tongue, let's shift our attention to another surprising trend that took Victorian dining by storm: pâté. Pâté was a culinary craze during the Victorian era, and its peculiar ingredients and presentation make it one of the most intriguing dishes of the time. While pâté today might be considered a refined appetizer, something served on crackers at upscale gatherings, in Victorian times it was far more than just a simple starter. It was a dish that embodied the era's obsession with extravagance, luxury, and culinary showmanship. The Victorians, in their quest for sophistication, would often serve pâté de foie gras, a rich, creamy paste made from duck or goose liver, during the grandest of banquets. But what made this pâté stand out was not just its ingredients, but its preparation. The livers were fatty and succulent, creating a spreadable paste that was often served with buttery toast, and it became the height of opulence. Pâté de foie gras had already been popular in France, but the Victorians embraced it with a fervour that soon made it a must-have item at any self-respecting dinner party. But the Victorian love affair with pâté wasn't limited to just foie gras. They also enjoyed liver pâté, made from chicken, rabbit, and even venison, with each variation offering a unique twist on the classic spread. Historians still debate whether the obsession with pâté was truly rooted in a desire to experience new, richer flavours, or whether it was simply another example of the Victorians' need to showcase their wealth through food. Whatever the reason, pâté became a popular dish across the upper classes, often served in ornate moulds and garnished with herbs, making it not just a culinary delight, but a visual spectacle as well. Interestingly, while pâté was widely loved among the elite, it wasn't just about taste, it was about elegance, and the art of preparing and presenting the pâté was as important as its flavour. The Victorians went to great lengths to present their pâté in elaborate, decorative ways. The pâté itself was often set in gelatinous moulds, giving it a shiny, almost glass-like appearance, and sometimes it was surrounded by delicate garnishes such as pickled vegetables, hard-boiled eggs, and aspic, another gelatinous creation from the era. Pâté's rise to prominence was inextricably linked to the growing interest in French cuisine during the Victorian era. French chefs were regarded as the pinnacle of culinary excellence, and the Victorians, ever keen to follow the trends of the time, adopted many French practices. Pâté was just one example of the cross-cultural exchange between France and England. But, as the Victorians became more and more enamoured with pâté, they began to take liberties with the dish, adding their own flair and using whatever meats they could get their hands on. Some recipes even called for fish pâté, which, while a little odd by modern standards, was not uncommon at the time. Historians are still divided over the cultural significance of pâté in Victorian society. Some argue that it was simply an indulgent luxury for the rich, while others believe it symbolised the growing internationalisation of British cuisine. Pâté wasn't just a French food, it became part of the Victorian desire to immerse themselves in continental sophistication, to show that they could replicate and elevate the culinary practices of France. The dish became more than just food, it was an expression of wealth, status and refinement. As the pâté craze swept across Victorian society, it became more than just a dish for the wealthy elite. In some cases, it made its way down to the middle classes, albeit in a much less extravagant form. While the upper classes continued to indulge in the finest duck and goose liver pâtés, the middle classes might have been content with cheaper versions made from pork or veal. But even these less expensive varieties were often served with as much fanfare and elegance as their more expensive counterparts. The Victorians had a knack for making the everyday special, and even a simple dish like pâté was treated as a celebration of luxury. In the end, what makes the Victorian obsession with pâté so fascinating is its dual nature. On the one hand, it was a delicious indulgence, a treat that elevated any dinner to something truly special. On the other hand, it was a symbol of everything the Victorians prized: sophistication, wealth, and the ability to present food in a way that was both decadent and artistic. Whether it was a lavish foie gras pâté or a more modest meat pâté, this dish encapsulated the Victorian era's fascination with making food more than just sustenance. It was about turning a meal into a spectacle. As we continue our exploration of Victorian culinary oddities, let's move to a dish that combines both oddity and health trends: baked fish and seaweed. Today we might think of fish as a healthy light option, often paired with salads and fresh greens. But in Victorian times, the way fish was prepared and presented was nothing like what we're used to. What's even more peculiar is the addition of seaweed, an ingredient that today might remind you of sushi or a trendy salad, but in the Victorian era, it was used in ways that seemed downright bizarre by modern standards. The Victorians had a particular fascination with seaweed as a food item, though they didn't always know how to use it in a way we'd recognise today. In fact, seaweed wasn't just a garnish, it was often baked alongside fish, or even incorporated into sauces and soups. Seaweed was thought to have various health benefits, and was regarded as a source of nutrients that could balance out the richness of the other foods Victorians were consuming. Some believed that the saltiness of the seaweed could help to preserve fish, especially in a time before refrigeration. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely liked the taste of baked fish with seaweed, or if it was more of a health trend pushed by popular theories about the nutritional value of seaweed. It's important to note that, like many of the strange food combinations Victorians experimented with, this pairing was likely influenced by the growing interest in alternative medicine and the idea that certain foods could provide healing powers. This belief was part of a broader movement that saw the Victorians try out all sorts of strange remedies and dietary habits in pursuit of better health, sometimes at the expense of common sense. Baked fish and seaweed weren't the only examples of the Victorian fascination with the sea. There were other dishes that paired oysters, sea bass and mussels with rich sauces, and seaweed was frequently added to these dishes to give them that natural feel, like you were eating food straight from the sea. The Victorians also loved to serve fish in elaborate ways, often cooking them in rich sauces and serving them with decadent sides. In a way, this strange combination of fish and seaweed could be seen as part of the era's overall obsession with novelty and exclusivity in food. But while we might scoff at the idea of eating seaweed with our fish today, the Victorians were onto something, sort of. Seaweed, in its various forms, contains high levels of iodine, calcium and iron, and it has been used in traditional dishes in various cultures for centuries. The Victorians might not have known exactly what they were doing in terms of modern nutrition, but their belief in the health benefits of seaweed was not entirely misplaced. Many seaweed varieties are rich in minerals and vitamins, which could have been seen as an added benefit for the health-conscious Victorians. However, historians still debate whether the use of seaweed in Victorian cuisine was as much about status as it was about nutrition. It's clear that the Victorians were fascinated by foods that had an air of exoticism, and seaweed certainly fit that mould. Many of the most coveted varieties of seaweed were not easily available in England, so incorporating them into a dish like baked fish became another way to display wealth and refinement. In fact, some of the finest seaweed, like the expensive nori, was shipped to England from Japan, adding a touch of the oriental to what might otherwise have been a rather plain dish. But what makes this combination truly fascinating is its long-lasting legacy in the food world. While the Victorians may have seen seaweed as a quirky, healthful accompaniment to their baked fish, today we're more likely to find seaweed paired with sushi or seafood salads, foods that are considered somewhat exotic in their own right. The combination of fish and seaweed may not have endured as a mainstream trend in Victorian cuisine, but it certainly laid the groundwork for the global fusion food movements of today. In the end, the Victorians' obsession with baked fish and seaweed reveals more than just a quirky culinary trend. It speaks to their desire to be ahead of the curve, always looking for the next big thing, even in the kitchen. The strange pairing of seaweed and fish, while an oddity to us today, was part of the Victorian quest for novelty, whether that meant health benefits, luxurious ingredients, or prestige. As we continue to explore the eccentricities of Victorian cuisine, we'll see just how far their quest for the unusual could take them. As we leave behind the odd combination of baked fish and seaweed, we're now diving into a peculiar area of Victorian dining, their fascination with edible flowers. Yes, you heard that right, flowers. In an era obsessed with grandeur, elegance and novelty, the Victorians found a way to incorporate flowers into their meals, in ways that may seem quaint or even absurd by today's standards. But back then, edible flowers were seen as the epitome of sophistication, added to everything from salads to pastries, as a way to elevate even the most mundane of dishes. Let's start with the most common flower found on Victorian plates, the violet. This flower wasn't just used for its appearance, it was believed to have a delicate flavour that paired perfectly with sweet dishes. Violets were often candied, preserving them for use in desserts or for garnishing cakes. Candied violets were an essential part of the Victorian confectionery world, appearing on everything from sugar-coated cakes to puddings. It's almost as though the Victorians had a special fondness for sweetness in nature. If you could eat it, they probably tried to eat it, even if it was a flower you'd expect to find in a garden, not your dinner plate. Historians still argue whether the fascination with edible flowers came from the Victorian desire for novelty, or whether it was tied to the belief that flowers had medicinal benefits. Many believed that flowers like violets, roses, and primroses could be soothing or have a calming effect. With the rise of the alternative medicine movement in Victorian England, the idea of eating flowers became not only fashionable, but seen as an effort to improve one's health. There were even flower-based teas, with roses, lavender, and chamomile being steeped into hot water to provide calming, healing effects. But more often than not, the flowers were eaten in much more extravagant ways, often in the middle of a formal dinner. The rose, another favourite of the Victorians, was used in a variety of ways in the kitchen. The petals were frequently incorporated into sweet sauces, jellies, or ice creams, as well as added to wine to create a flowery, fragrant flavour. Some versions of rose petal jelly were served as a topping for meats, oddly enough, creating a contrast between the savoury dish and the sweet perfumed jelly. Imagine biting into a hearty roast beef, only to be hit with the floral sweetness of a rose petal garnish. It was all part of the Victorians' obsession with combining seemingly disparate flavours to create a rich, multi-layered dining experience. But it wasn't just sweet treats that were garnished with flowers. Salads were another common place to find floral additions. The nasturtium, with its peppery flavour, was a popular choice for Victorian salads, often used alongside herbs and greens to give the dish a bit of a kick. Nasturtiums were not just added for flavour, they were also used to add colour and vibrancy, making the salad appear as though it had been plucked from a well-maintained garden. It was the Victorian equivalent of turning your food into a work of art. As strange as it may sound, the edible flower trend was not confined to the upper classes. While the wealthiest Victorians had access to the best blooms, those in less affluent households also embraced edible flowers, using them to brighten up meals and bring a bit of nature indoors. The use of flowers in food was a way to celebrate the changing seasons, with different flowers making their way onto the table depending on what was in bloom. Spring and summer, of course, were the prime times for these flowery additions, with pansies, daisies, and primroses making regular appearances. Historians are still unsure whether the Victorians truly enjoyed the flavour of flowers, or if they simply appreciated their novelty. Some argue that these floral infusions were more about status than taste. After all, flowers were often expensive, delicate, and rare, especially if they weren't native to Britain. To have a flower-based dessert or dish was a way to showcase one's wealth and sophistication, and when you served a flower-laden meal, you weren't just feeding your guests, you were also offering them a piece of nature's beauty, all while flexing your culinary creativity. The practice of eating flowers didn't entirely disappear after the Victorian era. In fact, some flower-based dishes have managed to find their way into modern cuisine, albeit in more moderate quantities. But the idea of adorning a dish with vibrant petals, or even infusing a beverage with floral notes, can still be found in today's high-end restaurants, just as it was during the Victorian era. The difference now is that it's more of a culinary curiosity rather than a status symbol. Nonetheless, the Victorians' love for edible flowers remains a fascinating part of their eccentric dining culture, a culture that embraced all things beautiful, even if that meant putting petals in your soup. Moving on from the fragrant world of edible flowers, we now turn our attention to a more practical and somewhat perplexing part of Victorian dining: the mystery of Victorian stews. Now, stews might seem like a humble, comforting dish, but in the Victorian era, they could be some of the most peculiar and eclectic combinations you could imagine. Stews, while traditionally a mix of meats and vegetables simmered together to create a hearty meal, took on a life of their own during this period, becoming a perfect example of the Victorian flair for excess, complexity, and, at times, confusion. Let's start with the classic Victorian stew, which could include everything from beef to ale and barley, all cooked together in a single pot, simmering away for hours. These stews were hearty and often intended to feed a large group of people, making them a staple in both working-class and upper-class Victorian homes. However, what set them apart from our modern stews was the constant experimentation with odd ingredients. You might find that a traditional Victorian stew could be cooked with fruits like apples or raisins, added not just for flavour but for texture and sweetness. Sometimes these fruits were paired with savoury meats in such a way that it was unclear whether the dish was a main course or a dessert. Historians are still divided on whether the fruit-filled stews were genuinely beloved by Victorians, or if they were just another culinary attempt to push the boundaries of taste. Some argue that the combination of savoury meats and sweet fruits was a symbol of the era's fascination with contrasting flavours, while others suggest that the stews were a direct result of ingredient scarcity or an attempt to stretch meat further by adding inexpensive fruits and grains. Regardless of the reason, these stews became a key part of the Victorian culinary landscape, where the more extravagant and experimental, the better. In addition to fruit, stews in Victorian times were often made with ale, wine, or beer, liquids that were thought to enhance the flavour of the meats and vegetables, creating a richer, fuller stew. The use of alcohol in cooking was not unusual during the Victorian era. In fact, it was considered to add both flavour and elegance to otherwise mundane dishes. But it wasn't just about flavour, stews were also about nourishment, and adding a little alcohol could help preserve the ingredients, especially if the stew was meant to last for several days. The result was a stew that wasn't just hearty, but complex, a combination of rich, savoury flavours, sweet fruits, and the deep undertones of ale or wine. And then there were the odd additions that made their way into Victorian stews. The Victorians were no strangers to using exotic spices, and stews were no exception. It wasn't unusual to find cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg mixed into the broth of a stew, turning it into a flavour bomb that would seem out of place in today's dishes. Some stews even included game meats like venison or rabbit, along with unusual herbs that could be found in English kitchens. The combination of game meats and hearty vegetables might seem normal by today's standards, but the addition of spices and fruit made it distinctly Victorian, bold, curious, and just a little bit over the top. Historians still debate whether the Victorians were truly onto something with their spiced-up stews, or whether they were simply taking their fondness for experimentation too far. Was it an effort to create flavour complexity, or was it just a way to mask the inferior quality of ingredients available at the time? Some argue that these extravagant stews were an attempt to impress guests and show off culinary sophistication, while others believe that the mixing of spices and sweet fruits with meats was a reflection of the Victorian love for novelty. One thing is for sure, Victorian stews were meant to be filling, impressive, and above all, memorable. They were a blend of both the familiar and the strange, using what was available in creative, sometimes puzzling ways. In a society where the appearance of wealth and sophistication was paramount, dishes like these stews served as the ultimate status symbols. If you could serve a stew that included rare game meats, exotic spices and sweet fruits, you were clearly someone who had mastered the art of Victorian dining. The legacy of these Victorian stews continues today, though in a much more restrained form. While we might not be adding fruit to our beef stews or spicing them with nutmeg, the idea of comfort food made with a variety of ingredients remains a beloved tradition. Whether it's a hearty beef stew or a vegetable pot roast, modern stews still carry that same essence of hearty warmth, though thankfully without the odd spice combinations that once dominated Victorian tables. As we continue to peel back the layers of Victorian culinary oddities, we now come to a fascinating yet often overlooked development in food: the rise of canned goods. Yes, long before the days of ready-to-eat meals in a can, the Victorian era saw the birth of canning as a way to preserve food for longer periods. While the concept of canned goods seems mundane and commonplace today, in the Victorian era, it was nothing short of revolutionary, and it fundamentally changed the way food was prepared and consumed. But just because something was preserved in a can didn't necessarily make it desirable, and the contents of those early cans were sometimes less than appetizing. The first commercial canning process was developed in the early 19th century by Frenchman Nicolas Appert, but it wasn't until the Victorian era that canning became widespread in Britain. Canning was seen as a way to preserve food for long journeys, especially for military expeditions or explorers venturing to remote places. The Victorians, always keen to improve efficiency and prolong the shelf life of food, embraced this new technology with open arms, though it didn't always go smoothly. One of the most common canned foods of the time was corned beef. Canned corned beef, which had been salted and preserved in a tin, was often eaten by Victorian soldiers and sailors who needed something that could withstand the rigours of long journeys. But corned beef wasn't just for the military. It found its way into Victorian kitchens, where it was used in stews, pies, and other hearty dishes. However, there was a catch. Canned food wasn't always well received, and many Victorians were hesitant about the idea of eating food that had been sealed in a tin. The process of sealing food in metal was still new, and people weren't always sure what to make of it. Historians still debate whether the introduction of canned goods during the Victorian era was seen as an advancement or a step backward. Some argue that canning revolutionized food preservation, providing a way to keep food fresh for longer periods and enabling people to access foods that might have been out of season. On the other hand, others contend that the quality of canned food wasn't always great, and that many of the early cans were poorly sealed, leading to spoilage and unpleasant flavors. In fact, there were instances where exploding cans were a genuine concern. Canning might have been an innovation, but it was far from perfected, and the early days were fraught with trial and error. But it wasn't just corned beef that made its way into cans. A variety of other foods, such as pea soup, stewed fruits, and even vegetables, were preserved in tins. The Victorians took a particular liking to canned peas and tomatoes, which were seen as convenient alternatives to fresh produce, especially during the winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce. However, much like their attitude toward canned corned beef, many Victorians had a mixed opinion of these preserved foods. While canned goods were convenient and helped to ease food shortages, they didn't always offer the same quality as freshly prepared meals. Interestingly, the rise of canned food coincided with a larger cultural shift in the Victorian era toward convenience and efficiency in everyday life. The rapid urbanization of England, coupled with the rise of the middle class, led to changes in how people prepared food. With less time to spend on cooking and more pressure to keep up with busy industrialized lives, the appeal of canned food grew. It allowed busy Victorian families to eat more efficiently, though admittedly with some sacrifice in flavour. Despite these initial challenges, the success of canned goods grew over time. By the late 1800s, canning had become more standardised and the food inside the tins became more palatable. For Victorians, canned goods represented the modern age, a symbol of progress and the future. The fact that food could be preserved and transported with such efficiency was a technological marvel, and even if the early versions of canned foods weren't always delicious, they were seen as a necessary innovation. Historians continue to debate whether canned food's popularity during the Victorian era marked a positive shift in the way food was prepared, or whether it represented a decline in culinary standards. Some see it as the beginning of the modern convenience food era, while others view it as a compromise between traditional methods of food preparation and the pressures of an increasingly industrialised society. Either way, the rise of canned goods in Victorian Britain left an indelible mark on the future of food preservation, paving the way for the canned foods we rely on today. While canned goods became a fixture in the diet of Victorians, they didn't necessarily replace fresh, locally grown food. Instead, they served as a supplement to the regular diet, a convenient option when fresh ingredients weren't available or when families needed an easy meal solution. And even though we now associate canned foods with quick, modern meals, for the Victorians they were part of a broader trend of convenience, a trend that would only continue to evolve as food technology improved over the years. Now that we've explored the rise of canned goods, it's time to shift our focus to a Victorian food trend that we might never have expected: the craze for health foods. Today, we often think of health foods as something modern: granola bars, smoothies, and perhaps a kale salad or two. But during the Victorian era, health foods were a different breed altogether. Some of them were relatively sensible, while others, well, let's just say they wouldn't make it past the first ingredient check on today's health-conscious Pinterest boards. One of the most famous health foods of the time was peptonized milk. Yes, milk, but with a twist. This health tonic was a combination of milk and a digestive enzyme called pepsin, which supposedly made it easier for the body to break down and absorb nutrients. It was marketed as a cure-all for digestive troubles, particularly for those with weak stomachs or those recovering from illness. The idea was that peptonized milk could help strengthen the body, improve digestion, and restore health after a period of sickness. But did it really work? Historians still argue over the actual efficacy of peptonized milk, though it clearly had a place in Victorian kitchens and medicine cabinets, with some touting it as a revolutionary health food, while others considered it a rather questionable fad. But it wasn't just peptonized milk that captured the Victorian imagination. The era also saw a rise in tonic waters and herbal elixirs. These concoctions were often made from a mixture of herbs, roots, and even alcohol, marketed as restoratives or revitalizing tonics. Popular herbal remedies included chamomile, ginger, and sarsaparilla, each believed to have dipyrote hortus and miski integrate, each believed to have various health benefits, from soothing the stomach to improving circulation. While some of these herbs did have legitimate health benefits, others were merely trendy ingredients based on unproven beliefs. Victorian herbal medicine was, in many ways, a precursor to modern-day herbal teas, though they were often far more experimental and sometimes even dangerous. Perhaps one of the most bizarre health food trends of the time was the belief that consuming large quantities of raw meat was good for you. Yes, the Victorians had a phase where they believed that raw meat, often in the form of beefsteak, had healing properties. Advocates claimed that raw meat could treat everything from tuberculosis to rheumatism. As strange as this might sound today, many prominent doctors and nutritionists of the time supported the idea that raw meat had more nutrients than cooked meat, which was believed to be too harsh on the digestive system. Raw meat eating clubs even existed in London, where people gathered to consume steaks, often served with just a sprinkle of salt and pepper. Historians are still divided on whether this was a genuine attempt at health improvement, or if it was simply another example of Victorian eccentricity. Given the unsanitary conditions and lack of refrigeration at the time, it's probably safe to assume that raw beef wasn't the healthiest choice for most people. On a more reasonable note, another popular Victorian health food was oatmeal. Yes, the humble oat became a star in Victorian kitchens, often eaten for breakfast as a filling and nutritious meal. Oatmeal was seen as a food that could fortify the body and provide energy without the heaviness of meats and fats. This wasn't as much of a trend as a sensible dietary choice, but still, it shows that the Victorians did have some awareness of healthy, natural foods. Oats were believed to be digestive aids, helping to regulate the body's systems and keep everything running smoothly. Oatmeal was often served with milk or fruit, making it a relatively balanced meal compared to some of the more extravagant and questionable food trends of the time. Historians still debate whether the Victorian health food craze was driven by genuine scientific research or simply by the period's obsession with novelty. While some of these trends, like peptonized milk and herbal tonics, had a certain logical foundation, others, like raw meat, seem far more rooted in the realm of quackery. However, there's no denying that the Victorians were interested in improving their health, and they were more than willing to try unconventional methods to achieve it. Today, we might look at some of these Victorian health foods and shake our heads, but many of the ideas they experimented with laid the groundwork for the health trends that followed. The obsession with herbal medicine, for example, sparked the herbalism movement that gained popularity in the 20th century. And although we no longer eat raw beef in hopes of curing ailments, the idea of natural, unprocessed foods continues to be a cornerstone of modern health trends. In the end, the Victorian health food craze was a mix of genuine experimentation and a touch of madness. But it was also an era that marked the beginnings of a more health-conscious approach to eating, one that would eventually evolve into the wellness movements we know today. As we transition from the world of Victorian health foods, we now arrive at another fascinating development in their culinary history: the emergence of Victorian fast foods. Wait, fast food in the 19th century? Yes, indeed. While we often associate the term fast food with modern chain restaurants and greasy burgers, the Victorians had their own version of quick, on-the-go meals, albeit without the golden arches. This was a time when industrialisation was rapidly changing how people lived and worked, and it wasn't long before quick, affordable meals became a necessity for the busy working class. One of the most notable forms of Victorian fast food was the street food culture that began to emerge in major cities like London. Just as today, many Victorians found themselves working long hours, often far from home, and needed something quick and satisfying to keep them going. Enter the world of penny pies, cheap, portable pastries filled with meat, stewed vegetables, or even mincemeat. These pies were easy to carry, affordable, and offered a satisfying, hearty meal for the labouring classes. They were sold by street vendors in the bustling urban centres, often wrapped in paper and eaten while walking. The pies were often baked in large batches, and workers would line up to grab one during their breaks or on their way home from a long day's work. Historians still argue whether the popularity of penny pies was born out of necessity or if they were truly a cultural phenomenon that reflected the increasing demands of industrial society. On one hand, the pies were practical, a cheap and quick meal for the working class that didn't require the time and energy needed for preparing a full, home-cooked dinner. On the other hand, they were part of a growing trend toward convenience, where even a quick snack could offer a sense of indulgence and satisfaction. The Victorians, it seems, were ahead of their time when it came to finding ways to eat on the go. Penny pies weren't the only fast food options available. The Victorian sandwich also gained popularity during this period, though it wasn't quite the same as the simple sandwich we know today. Victorian sandwiches often featured complex fillings, such as cold cuts of beef, pickled vegetables, or savoury spreads made from meats or eggs. These sandwiches were also sold by vendors, who would prepare them fresh on the spot, making them a popular choice for those seeking a quick and filling meal while out and about. There was also the rise of the chip shop, the Victorian precursor to today's fish and chips. Fried potatoes, or chips, became a popular street food in the late 1800s. Street vendors would fry the potatoes on site and serve them in newspaper or paper cones, with a little salt sprinkled on top. The chips were often paired with fried fish or sausages, creating a simple but filling meal that was cheap and convenient. The origins of the fish and chip shop can be traced back to the working class districts of Britain, where quick, affordable meals were in high demand. Historians are still divided on the exact origins of fish and chips, but it's clear that the dish became a cornerstone of Victorian fast food culture, just as it remains an iconic part of British cuisine today. While the fast food culture in the Victorian era might seem surprising, it makes perfect sense when we consider the rapid pace of urbanisation and industrialisation. As cities grew, more and more people were moving into the workforce, and the need for quick, affordable meals became more pressing. These meals weren't just about convenience, they were a reflection of the changing dynamics of society, where long work hours and limited time for meals created a demand for food that could be eaten quickly and easily, without the need for a formal sit-down dinner. Historians still debate whether the rise of fast food in the Victorian era marked a cultural shift towards the industrialisation of food, or if it was simply a natural evolution of urban life. Some argue that it represented a loss of culinary sophistication as people turned to cheap, mass-produced meals. Others suggest that it was a necessary adaptation to the demands of modern living, an attempt to meet the needs of a society that was becoming busier and more mobile. Regardless of the debate, the Victorian fast food movement paved the way for the convenience food culture that we know today. The idea of getting a quick meal on the go, whether it's a sandwich, a pie, or a serving of chips, remains a part of our daily lives. And while the exact foods have evolved, the core concept of quick, easy meals that fit into a busy lifestyle hasn't changed much since the days of Victorian street food vendors. The legacy of Victorian fast food can still be seen in the modern takeaway culture, where food is prepared quickly and eaten on the go. Whether it's a sandwich, a pie, or a portion of fish and chips, the idea of eating on the move remains a staple of modern life, and it all began with the Victorians' first foray into fast food. As we come to the final chapter of our exploration into the strange and fascinating world of Victorian food, it's time to reflect on the ultimate fall from grace of some of these extravagant food fads. The end of the extravagant food trends that once defined Victorian dining. The foods we've explored, raw meat, mocktail soup, jellied eels, and those strange fruit-filled stews, were once symbols of luxury and social status, but as the Victorian era drew to a close, many of these bizarre trends began to fade away, replaced by simpler, more practical dining habits. At the heart of this shift was the changing social and economic landscape of the late 19th century. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, the class system began to evolve, and food, once an ostentatious display of wealth, became more about practicality. The rapid urbanisation of Britain and the growing middle class meant that people were spending less time on elaborate meals and more time at work, with quicker, simpler options taking precedence over those showy, extravagant feasts. Another major factor contributing to the decline of extravagant Victorian foods was the growing availability of mass-produced goods. As canning and refrigeration techniques improved, so did the quality and affordability of food. The Victorians were no longer reliant on exotic imports or expensive ingredients to create their meals. Cheaper cuts of meat and easily accessible produce made it possible for people to prepare satisfying meals without the need for elaborate preparation or odd combinations. The rise of the modern grocery store, which became more widespread in the late Victorian period, also meant that people had easier access to fresher ingredients, and they no longer had to rely on the same complex, time-consuming methods to preserve their food. With the increasing availability of fresh meat, vegetables, and dairy, the need for exotic meats like crocodile or ostrich, or for complex preservation methods like jellied meats, began to diminish. Yet there was another reason for the decline of Victorian food excess. As the 20th century dawned, a wave of health consciousness began to spread across Britain. No longer content with the heavy, overly spiced dishes that had once been all the rage, people started to turn towards simpler, healthier, and more balanced diets. The Victorian obsession with combining sweet and savoury flavours in a single dish was replaced by a growing awareness of nutrition and the importance of balanced meals. The boiled calf's head that once graced so many dining tables was now relegated to the past. The strange popularity of raw meat as a health food, particularly among those seeking to cure ailments like tuberculosis, was soon deemed highly questionable. And as for the mock turtle soup, which once served as a playful substitute for the expensive real thing, it lost its appeal as the idea of culinary fraud became less acceptable. What was once seen as an inventive way to recreate luxury became, in retrospect, an unnecessary indulgence. While the Victorians had no idea that many of the trends they loved would eventually fall out of favour, some of their more sensible food choices, like oatmeal and the simple pie, would continue to be loved by future generations. The penny pie, once the staple of the working class, evolved into a more familiar version of today's savoury pies, served in more affordable, accessible forms. Similarly, the Victorian fascination with health foods that focused on herbs and natural ingredients laid the groundwork for the health-conscious movements that would grow in the 20th century. And yet, the Victorians' love for exotic foods and the concept of turning every meal into a luxurious experience lives on in many ways. Even though the raw meats, jellied eels, and floral-filled desserts have faded into the pages of history, the Victorians were, in many ways, ahead of their time. They were experimenting with new foods, new techniques, and new ideas about what it meant to enjoy a meal. Their willingness to push boundaries in the kitchen created a legacy of culinary experimentation that would pave the way for the development of modern gastronomy. As the Victorian era came to an end, these strange food trends disappeared, but their impact remains. The desire for innovation, the pursuit of the exotic, and the quest for prestige through food would go on to shape the food culture of the 20th century. Today, when we seek out new dining experiences or explore unique flavours, we're continuing the Victorian legacy of culinary adventure, minus the raw beef and jellied meats, of course. In the end, the strange foods we've explored tonight were more than just bizarre meals. They were a reflection of a society in flux, trying to find its identity amid a rapidly changing world. From pâté to mock turtle soup, from health tonics to street food pies, the Victorians embraced the unusual, the new and the exotic with enthusiasm. And while many of these foods have since fallen into obscurity, they serve as a reminder of an era that was constantly looking for the next big thing, both on the plate and in society. As the evening settles in and the world grows quiet, imagine yourself sitting at a Victorian dinner table, surrounded by the warmth of candlelight and the clinking of silverware. The Victorians had a way of turning food into something curious, inventive, and sometimes downright strange. Their dinner tables were filled with peculiar dishes that, at first glance, might make you pause, but there was always more to the story than meets the eye. Take mock turtle soup, for instance. It wasn't made from turtle at all, but rather from calf's head, transformed through hours of simmering with herbs, spices, and vegetables. The goal, to replicate the rich taste and texture of the expensive turtle meat, a clever and economical trick of the time. And then there were the jellied eels. Strange as it may seem, Victorians found beauty in the gelatinous form of boiled eels, setting them into a firm jelly that could be sliced and served as a unique dish. Though it may sound unfamiliar to us now, it was once a beloved and practical meal. Perhaps one of the more surprising dishes was toad in the hole, sausages nestled in a fluffy Yorkshire pudding batter. It was simple, yes, but perfectly suited for a hearty meal after a long day of work. And let's not forget the beloved spotted dick, a suet pudding filled with dried fruit, steamed to perfection, and often served with a smooth custard. A comforting treat that warmed the soul as much as the body. These foods, strange and resourceful, reflect a time when the Victorians had to make do with what they had, blending innovation and necessity in ways that are still remembered today. Though these dishes may seem odd, they were part of the fabric of their time, just as sleep is now part of the rhythm of your life. As you settle down for the night, feel your body relax, your muscles unwinding after the long day. The gentle glow of the Victorian dinner table, with all its strange foods, fades away, and now it's time for you to find comfort in the simple act of rest. You've spent the day reflecting on the creative ingenuity of those who came before us, turning even the most peculiar foods into something memorable. And now, like the Victorians, you can rest easy, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities, new stories, and new discoveries, just as they once found new ways to feed themselves. But for now, let go of the day. Feel your breathing slow, the soft rise and fall of your chest as you drift into a deep, peaceful sleep. Imagine the warmth of a cozy bed, just like those Victorians once sought after their peculiar meals. Each night, a chance to rejuvenate, to dream. Good night, and may your sleep be as comforting and restorative as those strange meals, filled with creativity and care. Rest well, and tomorrow, like the Victorians, you'll awaken to a new world, brimming with possibility.